to avoid buying your house back. That's the subject of today's show. It's such a different title. What's it really mean?
What does it really mean? Well, you're going to have to stay tuned to the Inside Track on Real Estate with the Decker team, where Yetta Decker
And Ken Decker.
and I often talk about myself in third party. So don't even think that that was weird, because that was really natural to me, even if it was unnatural to you. And so this show is really about what's natural and what's unnatural. Is it natural to buy your house back, or is it unnatural to buy your house back?
Well, if you're selling it,
right.
the preference is probably not to buy it back.
Right, except I'm here to share with you the inside track. That's kind of funny. The inside track. I know, at least I think I'm funny.
You are funny. And creative.
Very creative.
And beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I think this is a show about real estate.
It is. People like beautiful homes.
They do love beautiful homes. And so how do you avoid buying your house back? Strange title, and yet that is something that sellers struggle with really every time they have a potential offer, or every time they're in negotiation, or every time they put their home back on the market. So, and what we mean by that is when I have my home for sale and I'm in, as many times this happens, one of the most common is when I have an offer out, meaning I've received an offer and I've given it back to the buyer. So now it's out.
So we've countered it.
We've countered it. We've received an offer. We've countered it. There's lots of other situations. We're going to cover lots of stuff today.
So at this point, two people are buying the house.
Right. The buyer, and this isn't a non-multiple offer scenario. So that's where it's kind of interesting. We still have two people. And that is the person that wants to purchase it to move in and call it home, or call it investment and call it home for someone else, and the person that's selling the home. And every time you do a counter, in that moment, you're actually buying your own house back for the difference between what they offered and what you were willing to take.
What you want.
And what you want, or what you were willing to counter or accept. And so sometimes people actually, at the end of the negotiation, or the negotiation gets done, but then the building inspection happens, and then we're back to the buyer giving the opportunity for the seller to buy their house back.
Okay, so let's stay at negotiating for a minute.
Because wasn't that kind of a good explanation?
Yes, it was a great explanation.
Thank you.
And so what happens is at the end of the negotiation, it's either going to come to they agree on a price,
the buyer and the seller,
or they're not going to agree. And when I say price, it's more than price. It's the terms, the closing date, the deposit, the conditions, all that stuff.
The inclusions,
so
the exclusions.
So they're either going to come to an agreement on that, or they're not. And if it's not, what that tells me is the seller outbid the buyer to buy their house back.
Right. That was said nice and succinctly.
Thank you.
So the seller often outbids the buyer, which means...
Not often. Hopefully not often.
Well, it does happen a lot, though.
It does happen.
It does. And in this market, we're predominantly Ottawa market right now. We're predominantly in more of a seller-sided market. And yet there is still a limit to even in that approach. Just the other day, we were working with a buyer in the $1 million range, and the seller bought their house back for really very little money. Right, for very little money. The seller drew the line in the sand, and the buyer said, I told you I'd hit the end of my rope, or the end of my price point, as the case may be.
Or the end of my wallet.
The end of my wallet. I've hit the end of my wallet, the end of my willingness to pay for this home, given what I still need to do. And the seller got to buy it back. Not really the scenario that you're looking for. Now, it may turn out okay at the end, because somebody else may be willing to pay for it, and maybe the seller sleeps on it, and then decides they were actually really willing to accept a little bit less. Or maybe the buyer sleeps on it and decides they were willing to pay more. Or what we have seen happen quite often over the years is the buyer sleeps on it, and they're not even willing to prepared to pay what they had been prepared to pay.
Yeah, because sometimes the buyer, in the heat of the negotiation, in the heat of the moment, will get caught up with, it's only 10,000 more, or it's only 5,000 more, or
20,
whatever.
50,000.
20,000, 50,000 more than where we started.
Yeah.
And yet, after they sleep on it, sometimes it's, ooh, what have I done? I'm up fairly high now. I'm not sure I even want to pay that anymore. So we like for the buyer and the seller to come to an agreement. Now, sometimes you got to let people sleep on it, though.
You do.
Because sometimes they get more reasonable. Both sides get more reasonable after they sense the loss. The buyer senses the loss that they didn't buy the house, and the seller senses the loss that they didn't sell the house. Then they might start to get a little more reasonable.
Right. So this really, are you starting to get the sense, I suspect you are, that this really is not a science. This is actually an art. This isn't the hard skill of negotiating. This is the dance, the soft side, the software, so to speak, the dance of how to navigate so that when a buyer wants to buy, he gets to buy, and when a seller wants to sell, he gets to sell and doesn't have to buy his own home back. Say the way you said it one more time because I liked it.
I can't. Let's just say that the seller outbids the buyer in the negotiations to buy their home back. Yeah. And what my brother taught me a long time ago in the stock market, if you buy a stock and it starts to fall, if you wouldn't buy it at that price today, then you should sell it. So when the seller, if you don't want your house back at price X, then you might as well sell it at price Y and get rid of it. Does that make sense?
Use numbers.
Okay, so let's say your house is for sale for $500,000. The buyer's willing to pay $475,000. You want $480,000 bottom line, and you say, "Well, I'm going to buy my house back for $480,000." Well, if you wouldn't go out on the market and buy your house for $480,000 today, then you probably should take the $475,000 and run, so to speak.
Yeah, don't run. Stay available, because if there's problems or things that have to be navigated,
I know,
let's
but
do
it's
that.
a great saying. Take the money and run.
Yes, it is. It's a great saying. And it's not really like that.
Yeah, well, recently we had someone come to us for advice, right? On they're separating, and the one spouse had offered them a certain amount of money, and I won't give the amount of money because it might, don't want to disclose anything about the people. And basically, we looked at the value of the house and we said, "Take the money and run."
Right. We did say that, actually. It's like, yep. Even if you've invested more, even with all the scenario and everything that was involved, and of course it was complicated because generally separations and divorces are not simple. They're generally complicated.
I think that's why God hates divorce.
I think so.
Because it leaves a mess behind.
It does.
And anyway, yeah.
Take the money and run.
Take the money and run.
So you don't want to buy your house back if you've decided you want to sell your house. So
how can we avoid that?
Yeah, so a couple of key things to do to make sure that doesn't happen. In the negotiation, stay a little bit, or stay a lot, open-minded. Receive the counsel that's coming at you. If you've had 40 showings and this is your first offer, you're going to handle that. We're going to encourage you to handle that very differently than if you've had it on the market for 3 days, we've had 20 showings, and we have 5 offers on the table. Very different depending on where you have been and how you've been received in the marketplace.
Yeah, or even if we've just been on the market for 2 or 3 days and we have an offer, we'll tend to be a lot stronger on that offer than if you've been on the market for 30 or 60 days and had 20 or 40 showings, and this is the first offer. We got to take that offer very seriously.
Right, so timing.
Well, we take every offer seriously.
Yeah, we do. Even the low offers, because here's what's really cool about the low offers. They sometimes generate really high offers, not from that person necessarily. Well, mind you, having said that, sometimes from that person. When there's now the awareness that there's another offer that's come in,
from a second buyer,
that first person that came in really low now all of goes, I really do want that house. Do I still have an opportunity? And sometimes they've lost their opportunity.
And sometimes they pay the most and buy it.
Right. And sometimes they do. And sometimes it's the second one that's better than the first one. There really isn't a rule of thumb. People are saying, well, how do I know based on...
What is a rule of thumb? That's a weird saying. Like, you look at your thumb. What rule does your thumb have, right? What's a rule of thumb? Is that when you play thumbsies and you go,
No,
you do the little war?
I don't think so.
The one that wins is the ruler?
Okay, so the rule of thumb is just a general rule. It's the way it typically is. So the way it typically is there isn't anything typical. There is no rule of thumb around whether it's a first offer, second offer, or sixth offer.
I giggle every time you say that.
What?
Rule of thumb.
I bet you're not giggling. Well, actually, you probably are. You're probably giggling with Ken.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, okay. So the rule of thumb around which offer is the best offer when there's multiple offers and there's more than one offer is there is no rule of thumb. Now, the only part where there is a rule of thumb, stop.
Okay, the rule of thumb is there is no rule of thumb.
For that.
How can that be?
Okay, so there is a time where there is a rule of thumb. And that is from the same buyer. Now I've got the cameraman laughing, and so now I can barely breathe. Okay. Generally speaking, is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. When a particular buyer brings an offer in, usually their second offer will be better than their first offer if there is someone else that also wants that property. So if you come in at $480,000, you find out there's somebody else that wants the offer, wants the house, although you can't be told any details of the offer. The only detail you get to be told is that there is one, or there is two, or there is six, or there is 10, whatever there actually is, must be disclosed to all parties that have interest in the property.
And when you need to present by, basically.
Well, you don't give the irrevocable away even.
No, but they will tell you when they're presenting, so you want to make sure you give your offer before that time or else you may miss out.
Right, except you still can't, even in a multiple offer scenario, as a listing agent, disclose what the irrevocables are on the offers, because that is actually confidential to the offer and to the parties that are involved with that particular transaction, the seller and the buyer and the agents involved. Okay. So
we are so on a bunny trail.
Well, it's piggy trails because we don't do bunny trails. We do piggy trails. You know that. We're all about the wealth formula and building wealth. So we go on piggy trails, piggy bank trails. So the great news is the rule of thumb is usually it's higher. And yet that rule of thumb is thrown out the window when somebody feels pressured sometimes. Have you ever felt pressured and now all of a sudden you were prepared to pay $490,000, you find out there's another offer, you think about it some more and you go, oh, actually, just talk to my banker again, and now I'm only prepared to pay $480,000. So sometimes even on a multiple offer, an offer that's come in now gets reduced. And could you hold them to it? If it was unconditional and it was in writing, yes. If it had any conditions in it whatsoever, really you're better to release that offer and move forward with a different one. Right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So financing. You heard me say he talked to the banker and then decided to pay less. So that's one of the ways to avoid buying your house back is insure. And that means having a strong realtor on your side that makes sure that there is a pre-approval for the buyer that has brought the offer. Because otherwise you think your house is sold and now it's coming back at you, either in a reduced offer or during the conditional period. And really what we want to avoid is you don't want to buy your house back at all once it's gone conditional. That's actually the second. We've talked about the negotiation. Now the second risk time of buying your house back is after inspections or during the conditional period. And that's a very challenging time to buy your house back because we have to notify the board, the real estate board, within 24 hours. So basically immediately when a home is conditionally sold, we must tell in writing and advise and update everything to say this home's conditionally sold. As soon as that happens, agents and buyers perceive that it is sold. So generally showings reduce or cease. Activity and interest goes away. People move on to other properties and kind of forget about this one. So when it's that conditional period, if in fact things come up during the inspection, somebody has an issue with their financing, which is the one that is most concerning, then the sale falls through. And the bad news, there is no good news here. There's only bad news in this scenario. And that is the damage that's done by being conditional and then coming back on the market is irreversible. Like, it's a problem because it creates a perception and a picture in people's minds and buyers' minds and agents' minds. There's something wrong with it. Now, having said that, there are things we can do to reduce that impact, and yet it's vital. Like, this is a vital time to have an agent that can make sure that the buyer can qualify for the financing. That they're just not bringing an offer in with a quote-unquote pre-approval without having brought in their pay stubs and without providing their bank letters and their employment letters and without providing their tax returns and without providing whatever they need to provide to their financial institution to ensure they actually can qualify. The house has to appraise out as well, so that's another time you can buy your house back. During financing, if your house doesn't appraise for the value that buyer's paid for it, not a big problem in the Ottawa market right now, and it has been over time.
And if the appraiser wants in, even if it's not in the offer that the appraiser comes in after it's firm, you could be buying your house back if you stop that appraiser from coming in, because that appraiser is what the bank's relying on to loan the money, and they may say, no, we're not loaning the money if we don't have an appraisal in. And so even if it's not in the offer, it's a good idea to let the appraiser in.
Well, it's not a good idea. It's a necessary reality.
Yeah. Now, let's back the bus up a little bit, because we ran into a lot of the things, but how do we prepare before we even go to market to make sure we're not going to buy our house back?
That's the inspection piece. Right?
That's part of it.
Well, because during the inspection, if it doesn't show favorably, now you're back to the negotiating table.
Yeah, but I'm talking a pre-inspection. I'm talking before it even goes to market.
I know.
Okay, you can do a pre-inspection.
You can.
Which will allow you to find out what things an inspector may find, and a different inspector may find different things.
Absolutely.
But anyways, find the major things or the safety things, fix them up. Any delayed maintenance, take care of, because they're probably going to want it fixed anyways, unless you're selling well under market. Create a show home that there's a high demand for. People,
I don't have to create a show home.
People want to.
Ken's looking at me right now, but he should be looking at you because you're the one that's actually going to create that show home. We'll give you the coaching.
It's a good thing this is radio, because I got a face for radio, I'm told.
Well, actually, this isn't just radio. There's also 350 episodes of the Inside Track on Real Estate with the Decker team that are YouTube videos.
That's right.
That they just have to go to Decker team YouTube channel, and they're there. So there your face is seen.
Yes. And knowledge. Be prepared with knowledge. And one of the ways you can be prepared is to ask for our ebook called Buying, Selling, and Investing Made Simple. And you can get that ebook by emailing us at info@deckerteam.com.
And it has a lot of the tips and the insights and the behind-the-scenes truths that we've been talking about here, because you've got to know that in half an hour, we're hitting the high points. We're not hitting all the little tiny details. There's way more we could share after, I guess, even between just the two of us sitting here, 55 years experience, add the kids, we're at 75 years experience of real estate expertise and reconstructing homes and building.
55 years of experience between the two of us? That's scary.
That's funny.
It's funny?
Yeah, it's funny.
No.
Because I'm not that
old. Rule of thumb is funny. 55 years of experience is interesting. Okay, so now for our listeners who are on well and septic, you're selling your property. Most buyers now are doing a thorough inspection of the septic system.
Well, they're not. They're inspectors.
Well, yeah.
They don't crawl in there.
They're paying for it.
Yes, they are.
Well, the inspector doesn't crawl in there either.
Not anymore. They used to.
That's just crazy. Anyway, and also your well. They'll do a volume test on your well. Now, there's not much you can do about those in advance. Knowing, you might know you have a problem because your well is going dry or you're running out of pressure or that sort of thing. So expect you're going to have a problem. Also with your septic, if it's really super green and lush and your lawn is dry
septic bed?
everywhere else, you might have a problem because it shouldn't be super green and lush over the septic. It should be similar to the rest of the lawn.
Generally speaking, depending on the type of bed you have, there are so many different things that could be taking place. And yet most of the time when people say, my septic is fabulous, it's working so well, it is beautifully green and lush.
Well, and they think it's working well because every time they flush the toilet, it disappears.
Right.
But that doesn't mean the system's working.
No.
And so when something comes up like a failed septic system, that's the time to really open up your willingness to negotiate, because what's going to happen is if that buyer walks away, now suddenly you're going to have to put in a new septic system anyways and then go back to market.
Or put it back to market without repairing the septic system and advise that the septic system is near the end of its life or needs replacing or whatever the real outcome is. Because very few septic systems actually fail. Failure means there's backup or there's breakout. So most septics don't fail.
Breakout?
Meaning there's sewage on the surface. That there's gray water.
So when you step, it's kind of gushy.
Gushy, yeah. And I have sold homes like that.
Yeah.
Where the seller said, I ain't doing nothing. And the buyer said, well, I love the house enough that I'm still going to buy it.
Usually a price adjustment.
Usually. I did do one years ago. There was no price adjustment. But it had a shop. It had a shop. And they're still in the house and they love it and they're thrilled. It was the first time I ever did a septic inspection with an inspector where there was about 15-foot geyser came through.
15-foot geyser? When he dug the hole, it just shot
When he
up?
put the shovel in. And the water just came exploding out of bed. There was so much pressure on that bed. So that bed had failed. That was failure. Yeah, it happens.
Black gold.
Black gold, So really, most of the time you're not aware that there's issues with your septic. And people will repeatedly tell me, because I always ask the question, how old's your septic? When was it last cared for? Has it ever been inspected? When you bought 10 years ago, did you inspect it? No, we just had it pumped. And the guy said the tank was great. Well, that's really nice. And it's such a small portion of the picture. Mm-hmm. You can see some things in the tank. You can see if the levels usually operates at the right level or not, just based on staining. You can see the condition of the dividing wall. You can see the condition of the baffles. There are some things you can see. You can see how much of the solids go onto the liquid side and all that sort of stuff. And yet, for the most part, you don't know when you have an issue with your septic. Probably 80% of the time, when there is an issue with the septic, there is zero evidence that there's a problem of any kind.
Yeah. So
it's negotiation season.
Let's move off of that smelly subject.
Okay.
Let's move on to the stickiness. The stickiness of the buyer's decision to buy your property. Now, sometimes if you push too hard up front for money, and then there's problems with the house, they're either going to walk or they're going to ask for a big discount because they feel they've overpaid.
Right. And then it's an unreasonable discount typically.
Yeah. The best thing is where both parties, and it's not always easy, but where both parties believe they won. The seller believes they won and the buyer believes they won. Then there's some stickiness. The second thing is, let's get a large deposit. Because there are the odd transaction that fails. In other words, the buyer firmed up on all their conditions. We now have a solid, firm purchase agreement. Right. And then they can't close. Right. So the larger the deposit the seller has, the more sticky the buyer is to the transaction. If you've only got $1,000 or $2,000, it's pretty easy for the buyer to walk away from that and say, okay, sue me for damages. Well, they don't want to say that because they don't want to egg you on. But really, that's your only recourse, is to sue for damages. Now, if you've got $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 on a big house in the real estate deposit trust account, the seller can't get that money if it doesn't close, but the buyer can't get it either. And I did have a case where we had $50,000 in the trust account, and the seller won and got the whole $50,000 because the buyer had firmed up. Now, that was on a commercial transaction, but the buyer had firmed up and then could not close on the closing date. And the seller was able to get that $50,000 for their troubles.
Right. So you don't want to buy it back. So we want to make sure that the buyer has stickiness. So they're committed to the process and committed to the home. And you think, well, why would I put an offer in? Like, why would any buyer put an offer in if they weren't committed to it? Because there are buyers out there that put offers in on 2 or 3 properties at the same time. I mean, not supposed to do it, and yet I've seen it happen. I've watched this stuff in the last 30 years. And so you want to make sure the buyer is as committed as you are to the sale. And so making sure the pre-approvals are done, making sure that they don't feel that they've been squeezed so hard that the smallest thing will cause them to run the other way.
And the same thing goes for the buyer doing that to the seller. Because if you squeeze the seller real hard on the purchase side, and then there's something wrong, they're not going to be willing to do any repairs or take any money off for it because they felt they've already given up enough.
And then the seller believes it's actually better to buy my house back because I'll make those few repairs now. I know what they are.
And resell it.
And I'm going to resell it, and I'm going to sell it for more money, and I'm going to address those couple little things. And you, Mr. Buyer, were unreasonable. You were greedy. Yeah. And greed usually gets in the way of things coming together.
This one I really love.
So you love them all?
Yeah, but this one I really love because our 55 years of experience says we know how to write a great contract.
Oh.
And the stickiness of the buyer is based on how good the contract is written. If there's any mistakes in the contract, the buyer can get out right up to the day of closing if the contract's not done properly. So if you're thinking for sale by owner, be careful, because if you do not write that contract up perfectly, the buyer could get out right up to the day of closing.
Like, this is people's largest single asset generally sits in real estate. So it concerns me when somebody leaves it to somebody that doesn't do this every day, or that somebody hasn't done this hundreds or thousands of times, because there are so many ways that you as a seller could end up buying your house back. And I don't want that to happen to you. So
not when you want to sell it.
Not when you want to sell it. Otherwise, why would it be on the market? So if you have your home on the market, or you want to put it on the market, it requires diligent, knowledgeable, intentional behaviors, checklists, process to make sure that you actually get your home sold. So if you're thinking this has caused some concern for me, call us. We'll have a conversation with you about it to make sure that you're not missing anything.
Yeah, get the expertise of the Decker team on your side. 613-860-4663 and give us a call. We'd love to sit down and chat with you.
Don't want to buy your house back.